Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on NATO expansion and the Russia-Ukraine war. Today we'll be talking about the events leading up to the war in 2022, focusing on the fall of the Soviet Union and after that. And before we start, I will give the word to Cody to introduce you to what Resist NATO is, how you can get involved, and what we strive to do.
Thank you so much, Alexi. And hey, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. I think we have folks from multiple time zones and multiple continents on here. And I think that's really the spirit of the kind of anti-war and peace organizing that we need. A truly global movement if we're going to fight back against a global threat like the NATO alliance. My name is Cody. I am an organizer with the International League of People's Struggle Peace Commission. I myself am based in the United States, but just as all of us around the world, our organizing takes us to every corner that it needs to as we fight back against something as large as the US-led NATO alliance. So before we kick off this webinar, which is coming on a very, very crucial day, this third anniversary of the bloody, destructive war in Ukraine, we want to talk a bit about what the organization is that is hosting this webinar today. So this webinar is hosted by the Resist NATO campaign. Resist NATO is a campaign that is international in scope. It has been active since last year when the NATO alliance held its 75th annual summit in Washington, D.C., in the United States, and is now organizing and joining organizations from around Europe, across Europe and around the world, anti-war organizations, peace organizations, human rights organizations, migrant organizations, worker organizations, national liberation organizations, many different organizations coming together under the banner of Resist NATO to take action against the world's largest and history has shown most provocative military alliance in recent history. This is a campaign that is led by all of these organizations that is gearing up for a mass series of mass actions against the NATO summit in The Hague this at the end of this coming June. And this build-up campaign will include political education, like this one right here. It'll also include the creation of different propaganda and publication materials, and especially mass organizing efforts to get the word out and to build up to a huge people's showing against the NATO summit this summer. So, and in these pictures you can see here are from our past actions. You can see two pictures up at the top here from the actions against the NATO summit last year in Washington, D.C. And you can see pictures from just a few weeks ago against the Munich Security Conference that was just held by NATO. If you jump to the next slide, I won't go too much into this campaign. You should see for yourself, and in a minute we will drop the link so you can get plugged in. But this campaign is a broad anti-imperialist campaign that has a specific focus on upholding people's rights and the right to resist for national liberation, which is truly what the real solution against war and militarism would need to look like. To illustrate this, I want to read out our points of unity. And if you are in alignment with these points of unity, we hope that you will join this ever-growing campaign. So our points of unity for Resist NATO. is that we oppose NATO as a US-led military alliance that is a prime actor in imperialist and proxy wars of aggression, military occupation, and environmental destruction, resulting in the deaths and displacements of millions of people. We oppose US-NATO's strategy of expansionism and intensification of militarization across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe, and the complicity of governments of European Union members in further service of US geopolitical and economic interests in the region. We oppose US-NATO strategy of security through wars of counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, mass surveillance, and systematic attacks on people's rights and freedoms, as well as their direct responsibility for intensifying inter-imperialist rivalry. We oppose NATO's role in enabling the rise of far-right and authoritarian governments in Europe, and I must also admit, living in the belly of the beast itself, the United States and many other countries around the world, which use militarization and fear-driven narratives to erode civil liberties, suppress dissent, and undermine democratic rights. We oppose NATO's collaboration with non-member states through partnership programs like the Mediterranean Dialogue, Partnership for Peace, Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, and other frameworks that include governments such as the Zionist government of Israel with records of systemic violence, human rights abuses, and genocide. If you have feelings about these points of unity, put them in the chat. We want to hear what you think. If you jump to the next slide, Otto, I'll finish these points of unity, which is that we oppose, oh, one more slide back, sorry. We oppose NATO's push for ever increasing military spending, which prioritizes the war economy over social services and compels European governments to deepen austerity measures, undermining political health, public health care, education, housing, pension, and the welfare of the working class across the region. We support the right of peoples and nations to self-determination and sovereignty, the exercise of their fundamental rights and freedoms, and their right to resistance against imperialist aggression. We support a just peace through resolving the root causes of armed conflicts, allocating resources not to the war industry, but to serve and provide for people's needs. And we support people's struggles to assert their democratic rights in the face of increasing attacks on freedom, political rights, and social justice imposed by militarized and authoritarian policies. These are the backbone of the Resist NATO campaign. These are the points that bind us together in shared actions, knowing that we might not fully agree on every aspect of the NATO alliance and the pathway to just and lasting peace, but we can at least all hit the streets together and take action, knowing that we're all in agreement with these points here. So if you jump to one more slide before we begin this webinar, if you're interested in learning more about how we're implementing these points of unity through the campaign, we will be having an open campaign meeting coming up on March 10th at 7:30 p.m. Central European Time, where it's open to anyone, whether this is your first exposure to Resist NATO, or if you've been following us for a while, whether you're just starting now taking action against NATO, or you've been taking action against this alliance for years or even decades. We want to work together with any and everyone who is willing to throw down against this most aggressive and provocative US-led military alliance. So come through our open campaign meeting. We'll share the link in the chat here. And thank you, Alexi, just did it in the chat there. And without further ado, I will pass it back to Alexi to get us started on this webinar on the US NATO's role in the war in Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Cody. I really hope a lot of people sign up, and I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of new faces. And I will get started with the topics that we'll be looking at today. Um, Today we will be highlighting NATO's role as a destabilizing force against the Soviet Union as well as Russia, but we will be focusing on the events and NATO expansion after the fall of the Soviet Union. Then we will talk about NATO and US war provocations and the heightening of tensions, as well as the urgent need for peace after 3 years of the brutal destruction in Ukraine, and what we as a peace movement need to do, can and need to do. Before I get started on these 3 points, I would like to talk a bit about NATO from its inception. So NATO was established in 1949 in the aftermath of World War II, with 12 founding members, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and several Western European nations. The alliance's initial purpose was succinctly summarized by its first Secretary General, who stated that NATO's mission was to keep America in, Russia out, and Germany down. During the Cold War, NATO played a significant role in the ideological and military confrontation between the US-led Western Bloc and the Soviet Union. While direct conflict between NATO and Soviet forces was avoided, the US engaged in numerous interventions across the global South, often using NATO as a means to undermine national liberation movements in the region in order to uphold its neo-colonial control. In 1955, the Soviet Union offered to join NATO as a means to preserve peace in Europe, but was rejected by the alliance, as this would be against its existential purpose of protecting US-led military strategy. It was this act that prompted the formation of the Warsaw Pact, a similar alliance to NATO, but of the East European socialist countries led by the Soviet Union. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, which essentially made NATO redundant, NATO did not cease to exist, showing its true colors as a weapon to further US imperialist interests. So we will break down the webinar into 3 main parts, the ones that I've mentioned before, and we will look at 3 time frames, which will be 1990 to 2014, 2014 to 2022, and 2022, the outbreak of the war until now. So the first part will focus on 1990 until 2014. So NATO expansion after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Orange Revolution in 2004, resistance to NATO in Ukraine, and the Maidan Revolution. So one of the reasons the Russian government gives for the military invasion of Ukraine in 2022 are the broken promises by the West. US-led NATO not upholding its promises to not expand closer to Russian borders. This is also one of the most disputed topics regarding the war, which leads to disagreements and a lot of mental gymnastics among scholars, politicians, as well as the people. Some claim that although there were certain promises made by high-ranking politicians, most notably Genscher, former Vice Chancellor of Germany, James Baker, former US Secretary of State, among others, which you can see here on the slide. These were not in writing and therefore inadmissible. Others claim that certain leading officials were misled or misunderstood certain statements, like Yeltsin during his meeting with former US Secretary of State Warren Christopher, due to his intoxication. Others, even Western media like Der Spiegel, at least before the outbreak of the war, claimed that Russia has the right to feel provoked by these misleading statements. Regardless of whether these were put into writing, whether anything was promised or not, It was perfectly clear to the leading politicians in the West at the time that NATO expansion to the east of Germany was very risky and would be considered an explicit provocation by Russia. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, though, and all these promises made by Western politicians not to expand, former Warsaw Pact countries were immediately encouraged to join NATO so as to align market interests with the Western-led capitalist economy. As a result, NATO more than doubled in size and exponentially expanded its territorial scope, with the addition of 16 countries from 1999 to the present. Former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright revealed this intention when she said, NATO will do for Europe's East what NATO has already helped to do for Europe's West. Steadily and systematically, we will continue erasing, without replacing, the line drawn in Europe by Stalin's bloody boot. So as you can see, in 1999 was the first NATO expansion, including Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. 2004 was the second NATO expansion, including countries Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia. Important to note as well is the NATO Bucharest Summit, which pledges the eventual membership of Ukraine and Georgia. And Putin threatens to destroy Ukraine before it joins NATO. So this Bucharest Summit in 2008 especially was a big red line for Russia and led to the souring of tensions between the West and Russia. And taking advantage of the fact that that US imperialism was bogged down in Iraq, Russia waged a short, sharp war against Georgia, destroying the army which had been trained and equipped by NATO, and then withdrawing, having secured certain points of support, which broke away from Georgia, like the South Ossetian republics. Now we come to the Orange Revolution of 2004, which is also called the Color Revolution. And this was inspired by previous color revolutions which had taken place in former Yugoslavia and Georgia. And it was a series of protests in Kiev aimed at the overthrow of the elected president Yanukovych. Although this protest started due to the general population's dissatisfaction with the election of Yanukovych and questioning the legitimacy thereof, there's also ample evidence of significant US meddling, particularly by groups such as Freedom House, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the National Democratic Institute. Freedom House is funded directly by the US government. The National Endowment for Democracy, which the Washington Post itself in the 1990s referred to as the sugar daddy of overt operations, which did openly what had once been unspeakably covert, dispensing money to anti-communist forces beyond the Iron Curtain, as well as the US Department of State. US Aid and the Open Society were also alleged contributors. This revolution successfully led to Viktor Yushchenko, who was pro-NATO, pro-admitting Ukraine to NATO, and also adopting an International Monetary Fund structural adjustment program that benefited US investors, to become president. Viktor Yushchenko also awarded Stefan Bandera, a Nazi collaborator, the posthumous title of Hero of Ukraine in 2010. So how did these American organizations meddle in the Orange Revolution? They hired US pollsters and professional consultants to organize focus groups and use fake data and misinformation to plot strategy. They united opposition leaders to increase the chance of unseating their target, which was in this case Viktor Yanukovych. They even bust so-called activists from the previous color revolution attempts, especially from Serbia. And they also helped fund and organize the largest civil regional election monitoring effort in Ukraine, involving more than 1,000 trained observers. US government expenditure on the Orange Revolution alone has been put at approximately $14 million, while the overall civil society promotion budget set by Washington for Ukraine between 2003 and 2004 was between 57.8 and $65 million. I will talk about resistance to NATO within Ukraine. So in March 2006, a pro-Russian Ukrainian opposition bloc collected more than 4.5 million signatures for a referendum against joining NATO. And this move by the opposition bloc reflected the feeling of many Ukrainians, particularly in the Russian-speaking East, who had a negative attitude toward NATO. In addition, also in 2006, the government of Ukraine was planning to hold 6 separate military exercises in the summer with the participation of foreign troops, including the multinational Sea Breeze 2006 exercise with the US and a sizable NATO contingent, as well as the Tight Knot exercises with Britain. However, an authorization of these exercises by the Ukrainian parliament was still pending during the time leading up to the exercises. In February that year, the previous Verkhovna Rada rejected a presidential bill on allowing foreign troops to take part in the maneuvers planned for 2006. The arrival of Western ships in the port of Simferopol and Feodosia, containing 200 US Marine reservists, in June 2006, prompted anti-American and anti-NATO protests in Feodosia and Simferopol. And these protests also spread to Kiev. The United States ended up canceling the summer naval exercises, blaming the situation on the Middle East. However, it would be interesting to know how much these protests may have had an effect. Unfortunately, very little information can be found about these protests. I will now give the word to Otto.
Yes, with that we arrive at the probably biggest and most famous events, which is Euromaidan, which was a big protest wave, and in the end, it led to the ousting of Yanukovych, the democratically elected Ukrainian president at the time. But before we get into that, I'll talk a bit about what led up to this. So first of all, sorry, the US has been meddling in Ukraine's internal affairs since 1991. Victoria Nuland, herself at that time, head of the US State Department, admitted that the US has invested $5 billion US dollars in Ukraine since 1991 in order to promote democracy, as they say. Some of this money, like 22 million, were awarded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which was already mentioned earlier. And the founder of the National Endowment of Democracy once said that the NED does what the CIA did covertly 25 years ago. And Karl Gershman, the same man that said that, once, while outlining the NED's efforts in weakening Russia's influence in Eastern Europe, he called Ukraine the biggest prize in this procedure. And shortly before the Maidan revolution, the so-called, the NED hosted a talk given by Sergei Lashenko on the lessons that should be learned from the Orange Revolution. And within this talk, he particularly stressed the importance of funding or supporting social media outlets as alternative ways of informing Ukrainians. And interestingly, although you can still find this presentation on the NED's website shortly after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, all of the funding data, all of the money that was spent in Ukraine by the NED was scraped from their website and can now only be found on archive.org. As mentioned, Alexei already alluded to, Ukraine is a deeply divided country politically. So following the fall of the Soviet Union, the country kind of split in half, and you can especially see this when you look at the election results in 2010, the last election before Euromaidan. And here we see in Western Ukraine, you have a strong support for Julia Tymoshenko, who was very pro-EU and pro-NATO, while in the eastern parts of Ukraine, the people were much more in favor of Viktor Yanukovych, who, while generally framed as staunchly pro-Russian, is actually a lot more neutral. So he's open to collaborating with Russia much more so than Julia Tymoshenko, but not necessarily an agent of Russia or similar things as it's often framed in Western media. This can be seen especially if we look back on the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, which was originally drafted under Yanukovych in February 2012. And he himself said that, his government was at that point very committed to actually integrating with the EU and going through with all of this. And one important thing to point out is that this association agreement particularly outlined more military cooperation between the EU and Ukraine under the European Defense Agency or the EDA. And while on paper this is just an EU organization, the EDA exists under the EU's Common Security and Defense Policy. And under this policy, the EU also openly cooperates with all the other non-EU NATO member states, or at least the big ones. For example, the CSDP cooperates with both the UK and the US, where the EDA has agreements designed to provide a framework for transatlantic cooperation on shared defense issues, including supply chains with the US, and another framework, the Common Security and Defense Policy. Has also similar agreements with the UK. So far from just being a deal with the EU, this was much more a deal of military integration with the NATO bloc more generally. However, despite initially being very optimistic about passing this, shortly before the Euromaidan, Yanukovych actually stalled the negotiations in response to Russia pressuring them economically on the one hand, pointing out that if this deal goes through, they will have to reconsider Ukraine's role within the customs union, which is a similar organization as the EU, just led by Russia. And on top of that, they also offered an arguably better trade deal to Ukraine, which then led Yanukovych to stall the negotiations and reconsider, which ultimately led to the Maidan protests. So the first protests started after Mustafa Naim, who collaborated with Sergei Lyshenko, who had mentioned earlier. He had given the talk on the lessons learned from the Orange Revolution. So Naim and Lyshenko, they cooperated, or like they both worked together at the Ukrainska Pravda, a Ukrainian newspaper, which is also funded by the NED and USAID. And kind of funny side note, if you go to their website today, they're asking for Patreon support after the USAID funds were withdrawn. And so Naim, this man who set off the first protests, was later praised by Lyshenko for his online journalism. And the protest wave that was kicked off by Naim also saw prominent visitors from the West at these protests. So, for example, Victoria Nuland, the head of the US State Department at the time, was present at these protests and spoke there. With this, we come to the Maidan Revolution. And so despite claims to the contrary by pro-Maidan media, it's often portrayed as though this was all the Ukrainians agreed with this, and they were all very upset about this. Even the Washington Post later admitted that it was still very divided. So you had a slight majority in support of European integration, 40 to 45%, as opposed to 30 to 40% in support of integrating with the customs union. But nonetheless, it was very, very split. The country was still split, and this wave of protests finally escalates on the 18th of February, where you have violent clashes with the police, deaths on both sides, and a prominent German journalist, her name is Susanne Wittstahl. She visited these protests, and she reported when she was there that despite most of the protesters being normal Ukrainians with very legitimate grievances, because Yanukovych was corrupt and there were problems within the country, there was also a very significant presence of paramilitary neo-Nazi organizations and fighters. She reports seeing people that were clearly trained in fighting and very, very organized, and they confronted the police in very brutal ways. For example, there were reports of protesters using glowing rods of metal and yet sticking them in the faces of the police. And this, all of this was happening, and the police was ordered by Yanukovych to not really respond to this. So, like a lot of these police officers, or the riot police, just had to just stood there and took this. And finally, on the 20th of February, snipers opened fire on protesters. And once again, this was, and to this day, is framed as being pro-government snipers, although later investigations, particularly, what is his name? There's a Ukrainian-Canadian professor. If anyone's interested, I'll drop the name later. He has a very insightful work pointing out that the shots that were fired actually came from snipers that were controlled, shot from buildings which were controlled by the Svoboda Party and the right sector, one of these far-right organized militias. And so in response to all of this chaos and violence, Yanukovych eventually flees Russia. And just to give you a picture of the first of it, like this is an older picture of the right sector of protests, and you see Stepan Bandera in the on the banner. As Alexei also pointed out, this man collaborated with the Nazis in the Holocaust and rounded up Jews. And nowadays, he's often portrayed within Ukraine as a heroic fighter against the Soviet occupation, despite him clearly being a fascist. And this went so far that he was even awarded a Hero of Ukraine at some point, although I think that was reversed at some point again. And let me see, maybe Cody, if you can let me know if the sound works on this. Can you hear that?
Sound is not working auto, but maybe you can kind of guide us through what's being said here.
Yes. So this is basically a leader of right sector, no, of the Svoboda Party or right sector. I mean, in any case, they are very similar organizations. And yeah, like he's saying here, they have fun killing and they get weapons by the West, and that is what ultimately makes them so important and powerful. And yeah, so I mean, you see the subtitles. He's dreaming of splitting up Russia into different into 5 different countries. And yeah, most importantly, towards the end of this clip, he will point out that even though they were a minority at the protests, at the Maidan protests, they, as an organized paramilitary group, basically were the driving factor behind the violence, and then also they were the ones that entered government buildings and ultimately forced Yanukovych to flee. Let me see. Yeah, I'll just let this run. So he says, Maidan was the victory of the nationalists. Nationalists were the key factor there and clearly at the front lines. Now there's a lot of speculation saying where there were only a few Nazis. LGBT and foreign embassies saying there were not much neo-Nazis, only 10% of real ideological ones. The thing is, such a thing can only be said by the moron that doesn't understand that 10, maybe even less, 8% have much more influence in proportionally to normal protesters. Their effectiveness was endless, and if not for these 8% of organized neo-Nazis, Maidan would never have happened. This is in his own words. Of course, there's always a possibility that he's maybe taking a bit too much credit, but I think that this is actually quite a fair assessment. Yeah, these are more pictures from Maidan. So you see Molotov cocktails thrown at police. These are protesters, and you see the police is just holding up their shields at this point. There's not really even an effort on their part to defend themselves. So really brutal scenes. And yes, here you can't hear the sound, but this happened two weeks after Maidan. These are 2-3 MPs from the Svoboda Party connected to Right Sector, which entered the offices of a Ukrainian news broadcaster and assaulted him and beat him up. And ironically, this man that you see attacking him there is the head of I think free speech or something like that. So yeah, quite a bit of irony in that regard. I'll just I mean, I think you get the gist. So yeah, with this now, Yanukovych is driven out of the country. He fled to Russia, and so with this, we get the onset of the civil war in Ukraine. So the civil war is between basically the eastern regions who at this point moved towards separatism and the western Ukrainian. So it's split along the lines that I outlined earlier. And most interestingly, the interim, like after the Maidan revolution, there's an interim government that is formed to like facilitate the next elections. And yeah, this interim government and also then the government that followed later included people that were named by Victoria Nuland, who I've already brought up multiple times, was present at the protests and head of the US State Department. And these were brought up in a phone call by her, in a leaked phone call with Jeffrey Patt, another important US political figure. And so this interim government basically included exactly the people that she had a month or two earlier at least hoped to be in this government. So yeah, here's a clip of it, but I won't play it. And this is, I think it has subtitles. This is a speech by Petro Poroshenko, who would then, who was the head of government after the interim government, and this is him talking about how they will win the civil war in Donbass. So if he speaks of they, he's speaking about the Eastern Ukrainians. So he's saying we will have benefits for pensioners' children. They will not. Our children will go to school and kindergarten. Their children will stay in cellars because they can't do anything. And that's how we will win this war. So that was the rhetoric towards Eastern Ukraine that was then that was employed by the Ukrainian government. And at this point, the Ukrainian military is not super strong, and in order to fight the civil war, they start integrating a lot of these far right militias and organized neo-Nazi groups who were also present at Maidan and who had been training for such war for quite a long time. These are integrated into the military in order to fight this war because, yeah, as the leader of the right sector earlier pointed out, they really enjoy killing, in his own words. And so, yeah, here's, for example, this is a picture of the Azov battalion. And you see they're very proud of their NATO flag. They're also very proud of their swastika. And so, yeah, these are the people that then go and fight this civil war on the side of the Ukrainian state. And yeah, so early into the civil war, there is a first effort to negotiate a ceasefire. So this is the Minsk Protocol, or Minsk I, as it's sometimes called. It's signed in August 2014, so a few months after the civil war kicks off. It includes a ceasefire, and also it already includes local elections, and basically gives, like, at least should have given a certain degree of autonomy slash not independence, but autonomy to the eastern Ukrainian oblasts, especially Donetsk and Lugansk, because these eastern Ukrainians, who historically have been more sympathetic with Russia and also speak the Russian language, they were now in a civil war, basically waged by the Ukrainian state against them. And so, yeah, like the protocols outline a certain degree of self-governance within these regions, basically giving them a bit of autonomy. However, these negotiations are very fragile. The ceasefire collapses basically instantly and completely by January 2015, so not even 5 months later. And yes, then a second attempt is made in order to negotiate a ceasefire. This one is a bit more lengthy, and, like, more importantly, it gives even more concessions, basically, to the Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts. So it includes a constitutional reform to ensure the special status, so actually changing the constitution of Ukraine, and also, yeah, once again, self-governance. And these are things that the Ukrainian government had agreed on, although they were never really carried out. And for further footnotes of Article 10 included, among other things, also the right of language self-determination, assistance from central executive bodies for cross-border cooperation with particular districts of Donetsk and Lugansk with the Russian Federation. So already also the Ukrainian state agreeing to some degree of integration between the two. And then finally even acknowledged and gave Donetsk and Luhansk the right to form people's militias on by decision of local councils to maintain public order. So following these agreements, Minsk II is a bit more successful. The fighting subsides a bit, but it doesn't really stop completely. The civil war is still going on. It's just not as intense as it was before. And yeah, during this time, reports emerge about heinous war crimes on both sides. So Amnesty said that both sides are responsible for indiscriminate attacks. The UN accused the SBU, the Ukrainian intelligence services, of systematically rounding up and torturing suspected rebel sympathizers. And if you want to look into this, there's stories of 80-year-old men and women being abducted by the Ukrainian intelligence services and yeah, these people are just no charges; they're just taken away. And yeah, these are the latest figures that I could find, at least. So like regarding the civilian casualties, the UN reported that between 2018 and 2021, so not even the entirety of the conflict, 81% of the civilian casualties of this war occurred on the rebel-held pro-Russian side. So it really is at this point the eastern parts of Ukraine that are suffering the most under this civil war. So during the war, tensions slowly rise. In 2018, Trump first withdraws from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. So this is like a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which, obviously increases tensions between US and Russia. However, then, at least at the time, it seemed like a sliver of hope. In 2019, Zelensky was elected on a platform of ending the civil war, and he won with an overwhelming victory of 73% of the votes, since the promises of making peace and ending the civil war made him also very popular in eastern parts of Ukraine, which historically has always been hard to reach for very staunchly pro-Western, pro-NATO presidents. And following this, Trump, in his weird wishy-washy back and forth fashion, after initially canceling a treaty, then went on to briefly pause weapons shipments to Ukraine, shipments which Obama had earlier actually refused to carry out of fear that they may end up in the hands of neo-Nazi militias. And the Democrats' response to this was to try to impeach Trump. And at this point, the Democrats seemingly forgotten Obama's earlier concerns. And by this impeachment, they sent a very, very clear sign to Russia and to Zelensky especially. And so the impeachment manager, Adam Schiff, he said that the United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here. So already admitting that what this is really about, this isn't really about the Ukrainian people, but it's much more a plot by the US to weaken Russia by deliberately creating a civil war on its border and doing everything in their power to stop any peace negotiations in the meantime. And not only is Zelensky faced with this very clear sign by the Democrats, what they want, but Dmitrio Yarosh, sorry, I'm probably butchering that name, the co-founder of the Right Sector, in response to Zelensky getting elected on this platform, openly said, threatened Zelensky's life. He said Zelensky will hang on some tree if he betrays Ukraine, if he goes through with the ceasefire, and actually tries to put it into place. And I think I will just skip this because I do not have the sound, although I maybe will explain. Like, this is a video clip of Zelensky visiting the front lines. I mean, maybe I'll just in the background, because like maybe you can see at least the body language, although you can't hear the sound. He's here speaking to one of the Ukrainian fighters, and like he had heard rumors. It was suspected that these fighters were hiding weapons which they were not allowed to have. And so Zelensky went to the front lines and tried to talk to them and convince them to lay down their weapons. And he was just pretty much laughed at by this person. In the Kiev Independent, there's an article on this, and they translated parts of these. So Zelensky is speaking to this man. He says, "Listen, Dennis, I'm the president of this country. I'm 41 years old. I'm not a loser. I come to you and told you remove the weapons. Don't shift the conversation to some protests." And he then goes on to say, after this man like Dennis tries to steer the topic away. He says, "I wanted to see understanding in your eyes. Instead, I saw a guy who's decided that this is some loser standing in front of him." So you have to imagine this. This is the president of a country, of Ukraine, going to his soldiers and telling them to lay down weapons, and they refuse, and they laugh at him. This in combination with far right leaders threatening him in his life. It's really insane. It's insane to think about. And so Zelensky at this point, he's confronted with. There we go. He's confronted with the Democrats making it clear to him that they don't want peace. His own military, which at this point, as pointed out earlier, it's a lot of the people fighting in the military come from these far right militias. So Zelensky is in a position where really, if he goes on to carry out these peace processes, there's not a good prospect of that going through. He'll either get killed, or the Democrats may come into power, which they did after Trump, and then also he would have no support from the U.S. in ending this war, which ultimately, at least according to Stephen F. Cohen, would have been needed for him. And so this brings us to another interesting point. Like, these Minsk agreements, even though at the time they were portrayed as, we want peace, these are the purpose of this is a ceasefire. They were negotiated by Angela Merkel and François Hollande. So the at that time, the heads of state of Germany and France. And in hindsight, in December 2022, Angela Merkel came out in an interview with Der Spiegel, and she admitted that the point of these Minsk agreements was basically to buy time for Ukraine. And Hollande backed this up, and he even added that, the Ukrainian army was completely different from that of 2014. It was better trained and equipped. It is the merit of the Minsk agreements to have given the Ukrainian army this opportunity. And then also, like, in seemingly like shifting, doing a bit of a 180, despite being elected on a peace platform, on the promise that he would broker peace in 2022. Zelensky, also in an interview with the Spiegel, then turned around and said that actually he never believed in the Minsk Accords. He saw them as doomed to fail from the start. They went against Ukraine's independence, and they wouldn't have been possible under the Constitution of Ukraine, which, I mean, Ukraine signed these agreements, but apparently they never really planned on implementing them. And so with this, at the 2 days before the Russian invasion, Putin then declares the Minsk agreements null and void. He says they no longer exist, and yeah, in reaction to this, then goes and invades Ukraine. And yes, with this, we arrive at the final, not part, but at least time from the timeline, the third phase of this war, which is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so a month, so we'll go through the Istanbul negotiations, the consequences of war, and the sanctions. So only a month into the war, the Istanbul communique, so that there are negotiations in Istanbul between Russia and Ukraine to pretty much end the war. And once again, there are high hopes for peace, and so that now, like maybe this civil war that turned into an open war with the involvement of a whole state, Russia and Ukraine, that these would finally bring peace. And according to the leader of the Ukrainian delegation, they were actually very successful. So he says they were prepared, so they as Russia, to end the war if we agreed to neutrality and committed that we would not join NATO. In fact, this was the key point. So once again, this is very much in line with what Russia has always been saying. It's about Ukraine not joining NATO. And then he goes on and says, when we returned from Istanbul, Boris Johnson came to Kiev and said that that Ukraine would not sign anything with Russia and they should just fight. Gerhard Schröder, ex-German chancellor, he was involved in building the Nord Stream pipeline, so like he's generally well connected also within the Russian political establishment. He was also part, he was invited to mediate during these negotiations. He came out and he said at the peace negotiations in Istanbul, the Ukrainians did not agree to peace because they were not allowed to. They first had to ask the Americans about everything. And even Naftali Bennett, ex-prime minister of Israel, who also similarly played a mediating role, he confirmed this, and he said anything he did in his role as a mediator was coordinated down to the last detail with the US, Germany, and France. They blocked it. And so once again, we see that at this point, Ukraine doesn't really even have the independence to negotiate a peace in a war on their own territory anymore without the acceptance or green lighting of the leading NATO countries, of NATO as a whole. And so, in this regard, once again, NATO was clearly did not want this war to end at all. And I think with this, I'm giving it back to Alexei.
Yes, thank you very much, Otto. I will now look at the consequences of the war. The human toll of the Ukraine conflict is staggering. It's almost 1 million casualties, 13 million displaced, and cities like Mariupol reduced to rubble. Environmental disasters such as the Kakhovka Dam collapse compounded this suffering, and sanctions have disrupted global food and energy markets, disproportionately affecting the global south. Since the beginning of the invasion, the total amount of damages to residential and non-residential real estate and other infrastructure has amounted to more than $157 billion. What is also important to mention is that a number of European countries joined the US in sanctioning Russian energy with astonishing speed and solidarity, but at the cost of facing an energy crisis much more difficult than that which the US has had to deal with. Russian natural gas accounted for 45% of imports and almost 40% of European Union gas demand in 2021. On the 8th of March, 2022, a few weeks after the outbreak of the war, Biden announced a total ban on Russian LNG, even though the USA was not importing any LNG themselves. And on the 25th of March, successfully sealed a deal with the European Commission. And the EU signed a new supply deal with the US. Building these new LNG terminals takes years and costs a fortune, upwards of 100 billion euros. And not all EU countries have this infrastructure. So annual inflation hit 8.6% by June 2022. Although US President Biden promised to accelerate the widespread adoption of energy-efficient technology and equipment, gas supplies ran out faster than these actions were taken, forcing many European countries such as Austria, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands to resort to restarting old coal power plants, which were due to be phased out due to environmental concerns. The aforementioned Istanbul negotiations were not the only attempt at peace talks. A very important fact regarding this war is that 5 attempts were made at peace talks between Russia and Ukraine in the conflict's first few months, during which NATO promised Ukraine endless weapons and told them to reject any deal by Russia. Russia's primary condition, Ukraine remaining a neutral country, belies NATO's own declaration that Ukraine's future is in NATO. Such a statement, given the historical events that NATO itself set into motion, should remind us all that NATO's actions have never had the intention of peace behind them. With 500,000 soldiers or more, and more than 10,000 civilians killed, NATO's words and deeds in Ukraine are an affront to humanity. NATO countries have steadily escalated military equipment transfers to Ukraine. NATO members have spent about 100 billion on this assistance, with the US contributing half of the total amount. In an unexpected announcement in October 2023, the US promised an additional $60 billion to keep Ukraine fighting. This has offered NATO countries a chance to empty their old stocks and rapidly upgrade their own military technology, setting the stage for an apocalyptic showdown in Europe should the war expand even further. Predictably, weapons companies have seen their stocks rise higher than almost ever before, showing again NATO's role in driving war for profit. To end my part of this webinar, I would like to point out the blatant double standards in the media coverage of Gaza and Ukraine. As you can see here, the people at BBC News are very good at remembering Russia, but seem to have a lot of trouble remembering who is murdering innocent children in Palestine. This is an infographic created by Islam Channel TV, showing the framing of different events in the Ukraine and in Gaza. You can see on the left here that the events happening in Ukraine, the attacks by Russia are reported as fact, and as opposed to the Israeli strikes, which say reportedly, use the word reportedly. And then on the right, you can see the lack of emotional language used when talking about the genocide in Gaza. Here you can see again lack of emotional language and the use of emotional language on the right when talking about the Russian bombing of Kiev and justifying the bombing of Al-Shifa hospital as a targeted operation against Hamas. A study was conducted by Adam Johnson and Othman Ali from The Nation, comparing CNN and MSNBC editorial priorities, reporting, and commentary with respect to Israel's war on Gaza and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The findings showed that on CNN and MSNBC, the words war crime or genocide were mentioned at least 17 more times in the context of Ukraine than in the context of Gaza. And this figure is probably even higher because the count includes many instances of Hamas being accused of committing a genocide. You can see this on the left. The second graphic on the right shows the mention of child deaths, mentioned 4,223 times with regards to Ukraine, where 262 children have been killed, and only 3,632 times with regards to Gaza, where upwards of 10,000 children have been killed. I would like to mention that I in no way mean to delegitimize the suffering of Ukrainians or make them seem unworthy of mentioning. It is, however, impossible to quantify these disparities without comparison, and is necessary when showing the double standard that exists and why it exists, which is the fact that Israel is the USA's creation and Russia its enemy. I will now hand over the word to Cody.
Thank you so much for that, Alexi and Otto, for taking us through all of this history. I'm not going to speak too much longer here because I think we want to wrap up and would love to open it up for some questions and comments from all of you who've stayed on for this long. But we wanted to finish here by just making some closing remarks about action. So, given all of this history, 3 years into this war that we've attempted through this webinar to show is truly a US and NATO proxy war in order to provoke a war with Russia and weaken it on Ukrainian soil and fight this war down to the last Ukrainian and Russian soldiers. What is it that's important for the peace movement to know and take action on? I think that with the recent statements that US President Trump has said about ending the war in Ukraine, we are at a very significant crossroads, not just for where Ukraine will go, but what this will mean for Europe and the wider world now. And what is it that we can take into consideration while for what we can continue to fight for, knowing that regardless of whatever changes come from this moment, the anti-war movement will need to pick up that much more speed if we're going to catch up with the preparations for even wider war that the US and NATO forces are building on. Can you jump to one more slide for me, Otto? Okay. So some final points for us to consider here is one is that NATO is more divided than ever, and we can take advantage for this. NATO is divided, and this is actually good for the people. NATO is on a house of cards. The members are not agreeing with each other. It's never been more clear how deep these cracks are going. Even I remember at the last summit in Washington, D.C., when Biden said NATO is the strongest alliance ever. Our unity is unbreakable. Well, look at it now. Just not even a year later. This is not should not be scary for us though. This should be good because it's showing that our unity is stronger than theirs ever will be. They are divided on this issue on Ukraine, but they are not divided on maintaining imperialism and gearing up for more world war. So even though it looks like NATO is disagreeing with itself now about Ukraine, there are other much more catastrophic wars on the horizon that NATO is united on keeping the pace towards. And we, as a global peace movement, need to be ready for this and to fight against it. Take advantage of these splits. Again, we are more united than NATO and the imperialists ever will be. For second, ending the war in Ukraine, it's needed. It's going to be a great move towards peace. And again, I think that we, as a Resist NATO campaign, we are completely, if whatever the US is cooking on right now to try to end the war in Ukraine on their terms, even if it's on Donald Trump's terms, even if it's on the terms of the most powerful war makers in the world, this is still a good thing to end this war. It needs to end. The way that Alexei talked about this, we've seen 13 million people displaced from this. We've seen hundreds of thousands of people who have been killed, many soldiers, many civilians. It needs to end. So this is good if the war ends soon. But we have to remember NATO's presence will always breed more war. Why is it now that this is coming up for Trump and his regime? The US has spat at every single opportunity for peace. You know, we had both Otto and Alexei talk us through the Minsk agreements, the Istanbul talks. The US would whisper into Zelensky's ears and Poroshenko's ears and say, no, it's okay. Just keep fighting. We'll keep those weapons flowing. So if NATO was really clear, it was really on fighting for peace or aiming towards a peace for this, why didn't it happen then? It's happening now because the US and wants those rare earth minerals in Western Ukraine and wants to end the fighting so that it can start developing and privatizing the rebuilding of Ukraine. This is about profit, not for peace. And profit will always bring more war. It's what starts every single war we've seen here. So again, we can celebrate the end of this war if it does in fact come soon, but we have to remember that the fight for peace keeps going. And also sanctions, even though it might seem like there's talks going on between the US and Russia now, the sanctions against Russia, just like the sanctions against every country where they exist, they're still being kept in place. They're still keeping the people away from much needed food, much needed medicine, much needed development materials. And so we have to continue to fight against sanctions as a tool of war as well. Third, starve the war, not the people. End military spending. What we're working on in the Resist NATO campaign is actually a pamphlet that's going to break down the military spending by the Dutch government to get ready for this massive war summit that's happening in June. Did the people vote for this? If you're in the Netherlands zooming in on here, let us know in the chat. And if you are a Dutch peace activist, let us know what you feel about your government actually giving your tax dollars to hosting this. I know how I felt last year when this happened in the United States. It was a travesty. It was a slap in the face to all working people who can't even afford food, who can't afford to choose between paying rent for another month or going to the doctor. All while we're seeing more and more and more provocative war buildup. The fact that this military spending keeps going through the roof, that's a tool of war against us, whether or not the guns are shooting right now. And finally, and I think this might be one of the most important aspects of our points of unity in the Resist NATO campaign, uphold genuine independence, sovereignty, and the right to resist for liberation. I think something that's very important to know in the history we saw is that Viktor Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president that the Maidan Revolution was aimed against, was not a quote unquote pro-Russian president. He was a neutral president. He was making deals with Russia just as he was making deals with the European Union. He was talking to both sides, and regardless of the fact that his regime was corrupt and that people were mad at this and they had every right to take to the streets, this was an independent president that the CIA gave money and intel to fascists to overthrow so that an actual puppet president could be put in his place. So what does actual genuine independence look like? It means people who are fighting for their sovereignty. It means people who are fighting against any outside influence, and any people who are fighting for a genuine independence in their country need to be supported by the anti-war movement. And any movement that is supported on the outside by another imperialist with an interest needs to be looked at with the utmost concern. National liberation and genuine independence are key tenets of the Resist NATO campaign because they are the key tenets of just and lasting peace. A multipolar world might be better than a unipolar one, but we need to support, we can't throw our support, we cannot ask for some bigger outside power in order to protect our country, regardless of what country that may be. We have to remember also that for a long time there was a vibrant anti anti-imperialist and independence movement in the eastern Ukraine Donbass area that despite what much of the Western news was saying was fighting for independence not just from the Western-backed Kiev government, but was fighting to maintain their own self-determined nation of Russian-speaking people who are not looking to join Russia. And unfortunately, the war that has started has pushed so many of the people in this independence movement to actually push for annexing themselves into Russia, both because the Kiev government led a bloodthirsty campaign against them, given to them by US weapons, and also because Russia came in saying that the only solution for their safety was to join Russia. So, regardless of what kind of movement is being waged by the people on the ground to fight for their independence, we as the global anti-war movement need to support that. And we've seen what happens when those movements are not supported and are instead being given into the interests of the imperialists looking to dominate. So again, NATO is more divided than ever, but can be more united than they ever can be. Take advantage of those splits. Let's support anything that ends this war in Ukraine as soon as possible. But we have to be ready to keep on fighting. We can't end it and say that that's just the end. We know that more war is on the horizon. We have to starve the war, not the people, and fight tooth and nail to end this endless military spending. And finally, we have to uphold people's independence, self-determination, sovereignty, and the right of all peoples to resist and fight for liberation by any means they so choose. With that, this is the points of unity that lead us to continue to wage this campaign, and we hope to grow it every single week as we lead up to the end of June, when we hit the streets of Den Haag against this brutal and provocative military alliance that we hope we were able to show through this webinar was really at the root cause of the bloody and destructive 3 years of war in Ukraine. Let's fight to end this war and all other ones that we know NATO is just inching to provoke in order to fight for people and peace over profit. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to Alexi again to facilitate us through some question and answering and comments from all of you.
Thank you, Otto. Yes, so it is your turn to speak, everyone. Um, if anyone has any questions, please, I guess, you can raise your hand. That's probably the best way to do this, and then you can ask a question.
Just go ahead and unmute yourself, Tom. Or I think Tom was first. You're still
How
muted,
do I
Tom.
raise my hand?
Hi. Yeah, hello. Um,
simply to pass on the information that today at 12:30, our Labour Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer committed himself to NATO solutions. Some of his rhetoric, for example, he sees NATO as a bedrock of stability. He talks about peace through strength. That is Trump language. So our job really in our anti-nuclear movement in the UK is to try and expose this Labour leader for the trouble that he's going to cause. And the worst thing about it is they're taking money from the development budget in the UK, and they're giving it to the intelligence services, and they're giving it. They're proposing 2.5% by 2027, which amounts to an extra 13.5 billion per year. I think things are at breaking point, not just in the United States, but in the UK as well. And I promise you, we'll be working as hard as we possibly can to expose the injustice of this and supporting what you're trying to do in all the other countries. It's quite amazing what a global reaction we have today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom, for your input.
May I say something?
Yes, 1 second. We have a few other people that have raised their hands, but we will get back to you after that. Paolo?
Yeah, because I'm not able to raise my hand. I do not know how. Anyway, I will read a little comment about the matter, and you find it in the conclusion of the document of the contribution we prepared for this webinar. So, in Italy, the opposition of the popular masses to the war is widespread and increases their distance from a government that, in the European Union, is among the most subservient to NATO. I am Paolo from the Carca Party of Italy. It is up to us, Italian communists, to develop in every sector of the population specific operation to end our country's participation in the US-NATO war. It is up to us to orient every workers and popular organism against the Meloni government, the government of war, war economy, and subservience to the US imperialists in order to oust it, replace it with the popular emergency government from their advance to the establishment of socialism, the true and only way out of the World War III. It is up to us communists to promote the coordination of the many bodies operating on the national territory against NATO and its bases, as we have done since April 2024, contributing to the birth of the National Coordination Against NATO, a body to which we will take care to give any information on mobilization against NATO at the international level, as we are already doing for this seminar and for the mobilization that ILPS is organizing against the NATO summit in The Hague in June. The World Anti-Imperialist Platform, a coordination that arose in October 2022, will be mobilized on that occasion. It is our concern to feed the convergence of this mobilization with the one promoted by the ILPS. The platform and the ILPS are different coordination, but common is the enemy, and therefore it is of great importance that they converge against it in The Hague in the most effective forms to strike it. The Carca Party feeds this convergence just as it feeds the attention and participation in the Hague mobilization by the workers and popular organizations in our country that are coordinating against the US-NATO imperialists and their servants. Attention and participation that will be all the more relieved, the more united the NATO opponents march at the Hague. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo, for your input. I think next was Gregory. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Alexandros, and thank you all for organizing this seminar and webinar. It's been very, very informative. And I live in Canada, and as many of you know, Canada has been an ardent supporter of NATO. We are preparing to look at much greater war spending. And I've called my MP, I've written to the Prime Minister. We are an ardent supporter of genocide. Any type of dissent now is being silenced. We had one of our peace activists arrested this week, just released from jail last night. And the repression now is growing. And there's no way to penetrate the mainstream parties. I've virtually given up on our electoral system. So I'm just, looking for suggestions. I think this is a great start for like boosting a worldwide and global peace movement, which we need. I don't know if you have any suggestions for all of us about spreading and getting the peace movement to be bigger and bolder. This is a wonderful step in the right direction. I wonder if you have any comment on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Gregory. I don't know if you want to take this, Cody. I mean, I can also. So yeah, I would encourage you to join Resist NATO if you haven't yet. We have a lot of different committees. For example, the Education Information Committee. I mean, there are a lot of committees, but I'm part of that committee, which is responsible for this webinar, for example, and brochures and stuff like that. So that's very important for spreading information. But yeah, if you want to add to that, Cody.
Just that I think this is a time for the peace movement to say yes to many different tactics right now. I think if you're calling your elected officials, that's a sign that you're letting them know exactly what you think. That's actually an action. Of course, we've seen through years of doing this that they don't listen to phone calls, but they do listen to people taking the street en masse. So I think the question is, what gets the people out in the street en masse? I think it's important for us to remember that sometimes people, they don't feel the war right away. They'll feel the war in their stomachs when they can't afford to get food. They'll feel the war when they can't afford to pay their bills. That's again why we put on here, starve the war, not the people, fight against the endless military spending. So I think we have to get creative, especially those of us who are coming from the global north, where the wars are being planned and directed from. We need to unite wholeheartedly with the people from the South, and we need to not dictate how the people who are at the forefront of these wars fight back against them. I think one of the bravest and most heroic examples we're given of what it means to sacrifice for a just cause has been seen by the Palestinian people and their resistance forces. And something that a friend of mine that I met recently in the peace movement told me is that we can take nonviolent peace action while also being in solidarity with violent resistance that has nothing left to do but to fight back in order to survive. And I think that left a really big impression on me. And which is why, of course, our points of unity in the Resist NATO campaign very much uphold people's right to resist imperialism and to fight back against wars of aggression, even through people's war, if that's what it comes down for them. So again, I think this is a time to say yes, not no. It's a time to support many different kinds of tactics and find the broadest kind of unity possible, because that's what it's going to take to fight back the war makers.
Thank you very much.
Giorgio, if you want to go. You've been waiting, huh?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. Sure. So, hi, I'm Giorgio from Itpal, Indonesia. I'm currently in the Netherlands, but Yeah, I find that the topic that we're right now talking about, it's very crucial and it's very underrated, seeing how rampant Russophobia is in Europe and how all the wars are planned in the global north, as being said before. So I'd like to share with you all that I've been to Donbass before. I've been to Lugansk back in 2019. The As Cody mentioned before, at the time I was there, Lugansk was a place that were fighting for their sovereignty, and I was there invited by the Federation of Trade Unions, which is a member of the World Federation of Trade Unions and still are until today. And you can really see the narratives in the war that the Russian-speaking peoples in the Donbass, they're patriots and they're anti-fascists fighting against the neo-Nazis on the other side, supported by NATO. And other than what's already being mentioned, I think something really good to add would be to remind you all that the Zelensky regime is insanely neoliberal. Not only that it is fervently ultra right with its decommunization laws, they've also essentially sold out the entirety of Ukraine's labor market over the years since they've been elected since 2019. This is in complete stark contrast with Donetsk and Lugansk, which have both their trade unions being one of the central pieces of their government before Russia annexed it, and even after the annexation referendum. Uh, Still, the Federation of Trade Unions in Lugansk and Donetsk are uh, game changers in their own respective places. I think that's all. Again, thank you all for having this seminar.
Thank you very much for that input, Giorgio. There aren't any more raised hands.
Maybe I want to mention something because I saw earlier in the chat, I think someone mentioned the MH17, the like plane that was shot down over during the Civil War allegedly by the rebels, separatists in the eastern region. And like responding to this, I just wanted to say in general, like I understand that within the media context that we are in the West, some of this stuff may come off, especially if you never heard about any of this, as justifying Russia's invasion of Ukraine or anything like that. But that is not at all the intention of what this is. I think it's just very important to also, if you think of, for example, what happened in Bucha, it's the point of pointing out what the involvement of NATO in these wars is, that obviously huge tragedies have occurred on both sides, and both sides have committed crimes. But if NATO would have not pushed for this war, if the war would not have happened, neither any of this would have occurred, at least on the scale that it has. So I think that's always something that's important to keep in mind, and that I want to respond to.
Okay, thank you, Otto. If no one else has any questions, we would also like to give a very short input on the webinar on the 10th of March. Cody, would you like to do that?
Sure thing. So as I said at the beginning of the webinar, Resist NATO campaign is going on for a number of months leading up to June, when the counter activities against the summit are going to happen in The Hague in the Netherlands. This means that there's a lot of work to do. We have more educations like this to put on to get us on the same page about what NATO truly is and how we can fight back against it. We want to build up as much unity as we can around those campaign points of unity we shared at the beginning. And we want to do this in a way that builds the anti-war and peace movements that'll grow even stronger even after the summit is done. So if you want to learn more about what the campaign is up to in these next few months, how you can get involved, you can come by. This meeting will be an open meeting that will happen once a month, moving up until June when the counter summit happens, where we'll talk about the updates for the campaign. We'll do more, maybe shorter education like this on current events that are important for us to know about. And it's not just for us, the organizers of the campaign, to share with you all. It's a chance for you to come and actually share with anyone present about what activities you and your organization are planning against NATO this year. Because again, this is going to have to be a joint effort. We're going to have to do as much of this as we can together. So don't feel like you'd just be coming just to be talking to. We hope that you tell us also what you're going to be organizing against too. So come on through. And again, if you want to immediately now, if you've already been sold on getting involved in the campaign, I will share one more time our campaign webpage right there in the chat. Jump down there, learn more about the campaign. We'll actually post the recording of this webinar on that page in the days to come. And at the bottom, there's a sign-on sheet, and that's how you can sign yourself on to get involved, and someone from the campaign will reach out to you. But yeah, the best way you can learn more, come through on the 10th.
Yeah, so thank you very much to everyone that joined. We really hope to see a lot of new people signing on, seeing you on the 10th of March. And with that, I think we are done for today. Yeah, look forward to organizing with everyone and have a nice rest of the week.
Thank you.